Hello, I'm David Legge. In this presentation, I'm going to be talking about the the global economy and how we might make sense of the relationships between the way the global economy works and the patterns of population health, both the trends of improvement, the trends of stagnation, and the distributional issues. The global economy is terribly complicated, obviously, and in this presentation, I'm going to offer an approach to understanding, for the purposes of understanding public health, of understanding the structures and the dynamics of the global economy. I hope you find it useful. Global health is a slowly rolling disaster. I don't think there's any other way to describe it. While there is good health in rich countries, and probably for the middle classes of low and middle income countries, and there have been some improvements in MDGs, the bottom line emerging from the MDG reviews is that large sections of the global population carry an abominably high child mortality. That's 6.6 million deaths of under 5 children in the year 2012, 6.6 million young children dying. A very high maternal mortality, that's globally 289,000 deaths in 2013. Chronic undernutrition and stunting, that's almost a billion people in 2011 to 13. Almost 750 million people living with no access to clean water, and a billion people living with no alternative to open defecation. This is at a time when when human civilization, so-called, can put people on the moon, can produce wonderful iPhones. Look, it is a disaster. And while there have been some marginal improvements in percentages and some improvements in some countries with respect to absolute numbers, the situation remains a real challenge. Critical to understanding the global health crisis and the global distribution of health is an understanding of macroeconomics. It sets the context for global health policy, and we it and we need to understand how the global economy shapes how we construct health policy. The stories that are told about the global economy in the daily media tend to speak about the economy in ways that are structured around the interests of investors and politicians seeking to whose main interest is in growth in GDP, economic growth. But we're going to be looking at it in a different light. We're looking at how the global economy shapes population health and therefore how we construct health policy. Macroeconomic environment shapes, it's a two-way relationship. On the one hand, the macroeconomic environment shapes both healthcare policy, the care of sick people, and shapes population health. But on the other hand, in the reverse direction, health is also an input into macroeconomic policy thinking. The health system is a sector of the economy. In fact, in the US, it's 17% of the economy. And in most other countries, it's between 5 and 10%. So it's a very significant part of the economy. But secondly, population health is an economic resource. But this itself is controversial because in some respects, population health can be thought of as human capital, to be preserved, to be built as a source of productivity. But in many settings, population health is a consumable, and the negative externalities of business can be displaced to damaging, in some cases, the health of workers and of consumers. So let's examine these four cells in this two-way relationship, both how macroeconomic environment shapes health and how health is an input to such policy thinking. First of all, how the macroeconomic environment shapes healthcare policy. And I've listed three factors on this slide. First of all, of course, is the economy-wide resources to pay for healthcare. And this boils down essentially to tax capacity, if we're talking about the public provision, and private resources, if we're talking about care outside the public sector. The second area that I've listed here is what I think of as tax willingness. And that clearly shapes public sector revenue. Tax willingness is shaped by, first of all, the discourse of tax competition in the present environment, which is to say that countries are being pressured to compete with each other for lower and lower tax rates, in particular lower and lower rates of tax on corporations and on rich people and on investors, because if they don't compete, they won't get investment. The investment will go to other countries. This is the discourse anyway. The second determinant of tax willingness is social solidarity, a sense that I have some obligation to pay for my tax because other people in my community have needs which can be met through public services. And social solidarity is linked to inequality. In countries with a wide inequality, it's much harder to maintain the social solidarity needed to maintain tax willingness than in countries which have relatively equal distribution of wealth and income. The third way in which the macro environment shapes healthcare policy is in relation to the macroeconomic policy itself. And so in a policy environment where the private sector is seen as the source of all productivity, the source of all wealth production, and that wherever possible, services and production needs to be shifted to the private sector, then we will see such policies framing privatization in the healthcare system. But on the other hand, in the social insurance model, where employers are being asked to contribute to health insurance, we often find increasing pressure for public subsidy in order to reduce the burden on employers in such a system. And the US Medicare system, which has been in operation since 1967, was introduced partly for this reason, to reduce the burden on employers, the burden of paying for older people. Okay. So the second area where the economy shapes health is where the macroeconomic environment shapes population health and shapes how we address the social and environmental determinants of health. So on this slide, I've listed occupational health, safe and healthy urban environments, investment in housing and infrastructure, and keep in mind the huge urban settlements, as at the bottom of this slide, where in many of the developing cities of the world, where urbanization takes place without housing and infrastructure. So clearly, macroeconomic policy is framing the social determination of health in those sort of relatively unhygienic circumstances. Fourthly, social protection. Macroeconomic policy shapes unemployment benefits, aged care provision, pensions and so forth. And finally, economic inequality and social participation, which are significant social determinants of health. But macroeconomic policy also frames our capacity to address the social determination of health. Regulation, for example, in terms of decent laws which are policed over, let's say, occupational health, looking at the picture of the Indian miners at the bottom end of this slide, at the bottom right of the slide, or air pollution at the bottom left of the slide. And competitive deregulation is a major feature of the present global environment, where countries are being pressured to so-called reduce red tape, deregulate occupational health, deregulate the environmental conditions as part of a race to the bottom. It is an auction by transnational corporations and big investors to direct their investment to the countries which make it easier for them to make a profit. And finally, trade laws, which limit the government's capacity to regulate. And in this respect, I'm talking in particular about investor-state dispute settlement provisions and in investor protection provisions, which increasingly are being imposed in new free trade agreements. Okay, now let's look at the other side of the coin, that is to say the health system as an input to macroeconomic policy thinking. And on this slide I've listed four ways in which this is particularly important. The first, of course, is the out-of-pocket costs at the family level, and the less obviously the relationship between health security and household savings. In China, at a time when the economic policymakers needed the country to spend more and to move away from investment as a major part of expenditure towards more consumption, the Chinese policymakers agreed to dramatically increase the amount of money going into public sector healthcare security and public sector support for health insurance as a way of loosening savings. On the other hand, the notion of individual savings accounts, which is a feature of the Singapore health insurance arrangement, was designed originally as a way of encouraging savings at a time when the policymakers thought that that there was a need to encourage savings and therefore make money available for investment. So there is a link between the family insurance and household savings and the macro environment. The second item on the slide is the idea of private healthcare, and including private health insurance as an investment opportunity. And I guess the use of the role of private insurance corporations in both running health insurance or mediating public insurance schemes, such as Medicare, Medicaid in the US, illustrates this. But the standout example is clearly the pharmaceutical industry, which in some countries constitutes half of the total cost of healthcare. In other countries, it's down to around 9 to 10%. But if you're spending 12% of your GDP on healthcare, then even 9 to 10% means that you're still spending a very large proportion on pharmaceuticals. So pharmaceuticals, therefore, as an investment opportunity in the health system, in healthcare. We need to recognise also that healthcare expenditure involves the purchase of goods and services from other sectors. First of all, employment, of course, but secondly, from the financial sector, from the pharmaceutical industry, and from local buildings and supply industries. And finally, healthcare and related industries are also export prospects. And the medical tourism and other related ways of exporting medical care illustrate this very well. So that's healthcare so that slide is about healthcare as an input to macro policy thinking. But on this slide, I'm talking about population health as a consideration in macroeconomic policy thinking. And as I hinted before, we're looking at either labour as a resource to be consumed or labour power as a capital resource to be nurtured. And it's important to see these as two different dynamics taking place roughly at the same time, although obviously at different levels of the employment structure. The most obvious example of labour as a resource to be consumed is in slavery or poorly regulated mining, where in situations where there is no shortage of labour, or in low-paid mass assembly facilities where if people are injured or otherwise damaged, there's always somebody to replace them. So labour as a resource to be consumed are illustrated by the miners at the bottom left and the assembly workers at the bottom of the slide. Labour power as a capital resource to be nurtured is most obvious and common in relation to highly trained, scarce or knowledge-rich workers who the employer or the society has invested a lot in training and in educating, and therefore people who need to be looked after. And you'll find that we invest a lot in maintaining the health of such people. But at the bottom right-hand side of this slide, I've listed two other conditions where where disease as a cause of low productivity or of labour shortage has become so pressing that as to be a contributing factor to driving an investment in health care and prevention. And the foot that you're looking at the bottom of the slide is, you may recognise as hookworm, and this is a historical example in the southern states of the US where cotton workers were thought to be lazy or not as productive as they should be. And it was discovered that it was because they were anemic, because they were bleeding, because they had hookworm. And so overcoming the problem of hookworm increased the productivity of the workers. And the other slide at the bottom right, the other picture at the bottom right-hand corner of this slide is Kaposi's sarcoma, illustrating the one of the complications of AIDS, which in Africa is a huge cause of economic disadvantage, where labour shortage. And I'm not suggesting, of course, that we shouldn't be treating AIDS as humans, as part of solidarity, as part of brotherhood, sisterhood, but I'm making the point that in some degree the logic of productivity supports the investment in AIDS treatment. Okay, so there's the, just going back to this original slide, the two-way relationship. Macroeconomic environment shapes health, and health is an input into macroeconomic thinking. I want to move now to describe what I believe to be the prevailing economic policy paradigm, which is the dominant policy paradigm globally, which is often called, I find it useful to refer to it as neoliberalism. And I've listed three broad features of this neoliberal policy paradigm on this slide. First of all, low tax, low public spending. Governments should be steering, not rowing. And with this comes restrictions on public provision and on public funding. It is associated with this low tax environment and competitive tax reduction between countries, and keeping red tape under control. The second dot point is that somehow that private ownership and market relations are better than public ownership and hierarchies. Market relations deliver better outcomes than publicly determined, consensually agreed upon public policy. This may be true in some cases, but in many cases it is not true. So what we get under this ideology is the dominance of private healthcare, of private insurance, and of market relations being used as tools in health system design. The third feature that I've highlighted on this slide is that as part of neoliberalism is what is called free trade. I'm putting that very much in quotes, because actually what is being pushed is global economic integration, but it's not just some kind of neutral global economic integration. It's global economic integration on terms which are particularly favourable to the transnational corporations and the OECD countries in which they are domiciled. So you can look at the kinds of trade provisions which are being put in place under intellectual property protection, investor protection, market access, the continued protection of northern agriculture, the continued protection of giant banks who are too big to fail. These are all policy principles, if you like, which are being put in place through trade agreements, which are mediating this global economic integration on terms favourable to the transnational corporations. Now, this has implications for small farmers' livelihoods. If you're allowed to, if US producers are allowed to be subsidised in the production of agricultural goods and then are allowed to dump their subsidised goods on the big city markets in developing countries, this has a devastating effect on small farmers' livelihoods. Small farmers' livelihoods are destroyed. They go to the cities. We get these massive urban settlements with inadequate infrastructure and inadequate resources to develop that infrastructure. If market access is pushed too far, if developing countries are forced to reduce their tariffs to very low levels to protect and are unable to protect local production, that is a barrier to local economic development. And of course, we need to keep in mind the continued continued development of global warming and the reluctance of the corporations to undertake the necessary investment which is required to adapt to global warming. So are there alternatives to neoliberal public health policies? Are there alternatives to having our global health policy shaped by this neoliberal paradigm? Well, the most obvious sort of comment which has to be made in relation to that question is that global health policy analysis must incorporate an understanding of the macroeconomic assumptions which are informing different policy prescriptions, and must include judgments about macroeconomic policy settings. We need to be aware of the ways in which global health policy is being shaped and why. But I can hear already you're groaning that it's all too big. This is a very common response. It's all too big, it's too complicated, I can't grasp it. Leave it to the economists. Can we leave it to the economists? They seem to know what they're talking about. Do they? How much sense does the daily economic commentary make to you? How much sense does it make in terms of making sense of the slowly rolling disaster of global health? Interest rates are softening, all ordinaries strengthen today, exchange rates have stayed where they are, growth rates are up, unemployment is down, investment, leverage, and so forth. Look at all these terms. Post-industrial ratings agencies, soft markets, hard landings, asset bubbles, toxic debt, collateralized debt obligations. No wonder people feel that it's all too hard. Where can I find a comprehensive, objective account of the global economy that I can refer to for the purposes of my health policy analysis? Well, the simple answer is that it's impossible. There is no comprehensive, objective account of the global economy. This is partly because it's so complicated, and that a lot of the factors and drivers and forces are unknown or very uncertain. But it's partly because we are present as protagonists in the field of analysis, and our experiences and our purposes are present, irrevocably present, in our descriptions, explanations, and strategies. So if you imagine yourself trying to standing inside a room and trying to see in one glance the complete picture of that room, you can't, because you haven't got eyes in the back of your head. You're always present in the room, and there is part of the room that is shadowed by your presence. And it is the same, that we are protagonists in the field of social policy analysis, and our judgments are shaped by both our experiences and our purposes. The picture of the economy which is presented in the media is in fact structured around the purposes and choices of investors, business people and politicians, broadly speaking dominated by this idea of GDP, of economic growth. Economic growth with implications for the corporation, with increased profits, for the individual with increased wealth, and for the nation with increased national wealth and therefore more tax and so forth. Of course, the idea that GDP is automatically good doesn't get challenged in this model of thinking. But we need to keep in mind that GDP includes all commercial transactions, whether you're talking about about education or healthcare, or whether you're talking about cigarettes, smoking, and crash repair and junk food. Everything goes into GDP without regard to either distribution or the benefits, the social benefits. So it's impossible to present a comprehensive objective account because we are present, and the dominant account is shaped around the needs and purposes of investors and business people. I want to ask you to contemplate what I'm calling the partial stories approach, which is, instead of the comprehensive objective account of the world economy that we might like to have, that we focus instead on building a library of partial stories about the way the global economy works, which we can progressively weave together in larger analyses and larger strategies as we need them, in accordance with particular circumstances, particular policy issues, particular policy strategies, particular purposes. And the purpose of global health policy is not to see a progressive expansion of GDP. It's to understand the global health crisis, including its economic roots, and to develop health policies which reflect an understanding of the dynamics and directions of the global economy. So here are some descriptive, analytical partial stories which either describe or which offer some kind of analysis. The top one, the first dot point, is about the 1970s inflection. This is a reference to the fact that from 1945 through to, let's say, 1975, the global economy was booming along at quite a high annual growth rate. And even though most of that growth most of the wealth being produced was in the OECD countries, there was some degree of trickle down. From the mid-1970s onwards, we moved into a period of stagflation, a combination of stagnation and inflation. So there's a story to be told about the 1970s inflection. It's something to be understood. We don't have to try and immediately locate it in a big picture of the global economy. Just let's focus on what happened at the time and why. Then the second dot point is the story about the debt trap. That OPEC increased its prices in 1973, that money was being widely lent to countries at negative interest rates which were lower than the rate of inflation, but that the debt trap was sprung in 1981 with the dramatic increase in interest rates, which meant a lot of developing countries fell into deep trouble, which meant that they had to go to the IMF, which imposed structural adjustment. Let's not try and locate it in bigger picture than that. That's a big enough story. Try to understand that one. His third dot point, that trying to understand the fluctuating levels of development assistance in relation to global events and concerns. There was a massive increase in development assistance for health from around the year 2000. Why did that take place? It's a question to be examined on its own, not necessarily as part of a bigger picture. Why has there been such a dramatic increase in trade liberalisation? What is it about the global economy that has demanded this increase in trade liberalisation, and who is driving it? What was this story about the ballooning private, corporate and national debt? I'm not sure if you're familiar with the background to the subprime mortgage crisis from 2008 in the US, which then flowed across to the sovereign debt crisis in Europe. But one of the preceding dynamics behind that was a huge ballooning of both private debt, that's household debt, of corporate debt, that's to say government corporations borrowing money, and national debt. And with that was the growth of the financial sector. So let's just take that as a story by itself. The story about the 1997 Asian collapse is an interesting one. This is a story about speculation, in particular on the Thai baht, a sudden outflow of money from Thailand, driven by speculators in the money market, leading to the collapse of the Thai economy, and the refusal of Dr. Mahathir in Malaysia to accept the instructions of the IMF that they should not impose capital controls. Mahathir had imposed capital controls earlier, and Malaysia was spared the worst of the debt crisis of the Asian collapse in 1997. This is a story about capital controls. Don't worry about the bigger picture. Let's just think about what is the significance of capital controls. Then there's a story about the US trade deficit and the value of the US dollar. In almost every other country except the US, if you run a trade deficit, that's to say you're buying more than you're selling, then you're putting more of your own currency into the global marketplace, and the price of your currency will fall. That's to say that your currency will depreciate, and you'll be able to sell more but buy less. But the value of the US dollar has been maintained. Why is that? There's a story to be told. And I've touched upon the mortgage crisis of 2008 and the sovereign debt crisis of the Eurozone. So I'm urging you to think in terms of partial stories. You don't have to understand everything. Just work on these kind of events, try and understand them. So those were more or less descriptive or interpretive or analytical stories. Here's some explanatory partial stories. One is about the big picture, that growth is essential, that wealth trickles down, that inequality is inevitable, but in due course inequality will reduce, that there will be increasing equality. That's one story. Another story is that we are facing, at least in particular in the industrial, developed, rich world, a crisis of overproduction. I'll come back to this, but it's a story about how to understand the big picture. The second dot point on this slide is really a question. How to explain rich world acquiescence to widening polarization? How to explain our acceptance of the obscene lifestyles of the rich and famous as compared to the billion of people who are living in very difficult circumstances? And I'm suggesting three partial stories, which might help to explain this. One is the manufacture of consent. This is a reference to a book by Noam Chomsky, who emphasized the role of propaganda in and the way in which the media and other players shape public opinion. But I think it's also important to think about economic insecurity as a driver of xenophobia. So if people are insecure about their own jobs, about their ability to pay for healthcare, about their ability to educate their children, about their economic security in retirement, then they're going to be far less generous in thinking about people who are less well off than they, including refugees. And in those circumstances, the dynamics of political populism can bring out both the worst and the best in people, but in those circumstances, likely it'll be the worst. A second partial story to explain rich world acquiescence to widening polarization might be something about complexity, confusion, and impotence. And of course, this is the economy is very complex. Most of us are very confused, and many of us feel quite impotent to actually make any change to this sort of widening polarization. And finally, of course, there is our mutual dependence on the current economic configuration. The fact of the matter is that the rich world benefits. The people living in the rich world benefit from the unfair economic circumstances, and this clearly has to shape, in some degree, how we view them. Okay, so there are some explanatory partial stories. And on here, this slide, I've listed some what you might call strategic partial stories. In other words, stories about ways in which policies which might be adopted, none of which are comprehensive and exhaustive, but all of which tell a little bit of the story. One is the importance of promoting fair trade as a pathway to development. Another is about protecting local production, local supply of goods and services, rather than full global integration. Another story, which I feel strongly about, is about restoring the sovereignty of the nation state vis-a-vis the transnational corporation. It's one of the big transitions taking place at this time, is the ascending power of the transnational corporation and transnational bank, and the classes which sail with in these vessels, vis-a-vis the nation state. And so I think there is a partial story to be said about the sovereignty of the nation state. Likewise, reforming global economic regulation, reforming development assistance, and finally building a globalized social movement, building globalizing social movements for reform. These are some useful but partial stories about strategy. Okay, so this is a background. This idea of partial stories is a background to the way in which I'm going to tell a story about the global economy since World War II. And the story will trace through what I'm calling the long boom of 45 to 75, stagflation, let's say 75 to 85, the rise of neoliberalism and the rolling crisis of overproduction from 81 through to 2007, the subprime mortgage crisis and the global recession associated with that from 2007, 2009, and the sovereign debt crisis in Europe and global stagnation since then, and the rising threat of a further crisis, in particular in the emerging economies, from 2014. Okay, so that's the sort of the contents list. Let's examine this long boom. The period 1945 to 1975 was characterized by high growth rates, relatively unprecedented. And it's important to try and understand what was going on. The triggers, I guess, are the need for reconstruction after the war. There was huge demand by people who'd gone without. The dramatic increases in productivity associated, let's say, with motor vehicles, cheap oil, new materials, and so forth, and the huge industrial capacity which was released by post-war demobilisation. So this is the environment. But what were the dynamics of the long boom? Well, the story I'm telling here is that if you bring capital and technology to and relatively unproductive labour together to make things and services that people want and are willing to pay for, this is a condition for a booming economy. Bringing capital, labour and technology together to make things that people need and are able to pay for. And this was the underlying dynamic of the long boom. Increased productivity associated with new technology frees up labour to make new things, to recycle wages as consumption so that workers buy stuff, and hence there is more profit, more investment and more sales. There was some, during this time, there was some trickle down to the poor, both in the rich world and in the third world. Trickle down to the poor in the rich world was more or less associated with Keynesian economic control policies, and to the third world from trade opportunities associated with rapid growth. So the long boom sets the scene for the period of stagflation from 1975 to 1985. This is more difficult. The recession of the mid-1970s was a cyclical slowdown, that's to say the ordinary business cycle of boom and bust, but on top of structural overproduction. There was a growing imbalance between productive capacity globally and market demand. The market demand from the people who already had purchased was slacking off because they were so-called mature markets, and market demand from people who had huge needs was weak because they didn't have the money to pay for it. This is the period of the beginning emergence of jobless growth, because with increasing technology, you've got a weakening role of employment and a weakening role of wages being recycled as consumption. With this came an emerging inflation. Keynesian policies were being deployed to contain the slowdown, but they were not effective for various complicated reasons. However, they may have actually contributed to increasing inflation. There were increasing price pressures as different players, the unions, the corporations, the monopolies, sought to protect their share of national income. And a particular issue at this time was that goods and services for the Vietnam War were being sourced from outside the USA, paid for in dollars, which had the effect of flooding the world with dollars, increasing the global money supply and leading to a global inflation, as well as a depreciation of the US dollar. This slide probably needs to be looked at carefully and slowly at some later date. But it's a very the emergence of stagflation, stagnation and inflation is quite critical to understanding what came next. And what came next was monetarism. From 1981, at a period when Reagan was the president in the US and Thatcher was prime minister in Britain, the economic policy paradigm of monetarism overcame the previous dominant thinking of Keynesianism, and the view grew that public debt and public expenditure were not working as ways of controlling the economy, and that we should rely solely on interest rates to control the business cycle. A slogan called "Fight Inflation First" was prevailing at this time, and there were steep increases in interest rates to control inflation. The huge increases in interest rates up to 19-20% in 1981 had the effect of slowing the economy down, greatly decreasing demand, and therefore controlling price increases, controlling inflation. It also had the effect of massively increasing unemployment, weakening the unions, and strengthening the capacity of government and business to control wages growth. And it was accompanied by a fairly aggressive industrial relations strategy. The story about fight inflation first needs to be modified somewhat because, in part, the steep increase in interest rates was explicitly designed to break the unions. Organised labour, unionised labour, was seen as the principal cause of the inflation and therefore of the recession, and it was necessary to break the unions. And this was done by increasing interest rates, increasing unemployment, and aggressive industrial relations strategies. Okay, so this is what was happening in 1981, 82, 83 in the rich world. What was the impact in the poor world? We need to go back to 1973 to understand the setting of the debt trap and then the springing of the debt trap. In 1973, the inflation was starting to rise, and the Organisation of Petroleum Exporting Countries, that's mainly the Arab countries, elected to increase the price of oil quite significantly. This was in part to compensate for emerging inflation and to maintain the value of their revenues from oil sales, but it was also in part an intervention in the Arab-Israeli contradictions at the time, the war at that time. So the price of oil rose, and the oil producers were flush with cash. They didn't have immediate use for their cash. They put it in the banks, particularly the European and American banks. And then the banks have got the challenge of making sure this money is lent out. So the banks send their salespeople around the world lending money at low or negative interest rates. That's to say negative because their interest rates are lower than the inflation level. Lending to corporations in South America, but with the government guarantee. So when the corporations go bang, the government picks up the debt. And lending directly to governments in Africa. Presumably, some of those borrowings were by crooks. Some of them were by democratic governments who were committed to improving the lives of their people. However, it made no difference in 1981 when interest rates started to escalate. Now, the debt trap was not directed at the developing countries, but from 1981, interest rates accelerate, peaking at 17% in the US in 1981 at a time of recession, imposing repayment and servicing burdens that the poor countries just could not carry. As each debt tranche was turned over and low interest rates were replaced by high interest rates, the countries were increasingly forced to turn to the IMF as the lender of last resort, and were subject to structural adjustment, which we've talked about in a different presentation. In Latin America, the 1980s are often referred to as the lost decade. And from 1984, the global resource flows started to reverse under the influence of debt repayment and the policies which were imposed under structural adjustment. The flow of resources, in a net sense, increasingly flows from south to north. Okay, so that's the debt trap, the period of the 1980s, the lost decade. What about from 1980 to now? Well, this is quite complicated because from 1980 to now, there are two parallel dynamics operating, and they feed off each other and compete with each other in interesting ways. One is the continuing dynamic of the long boom in China in particular, but also India and some of the other emerging economies. And the other is the continuing threat of post-Fordist crisis, the crisis of structural overproduction, over-accumulation. And of course, on top of these are the challenges of climate change, peak oil and food insecurity, which are of course related to these. But let's focus on these two parallel dynamics. First of all, the continuing dynamic of the long boom, in particular in China. China's growth from 1978 has been quite dramatic. And I think it's useful to think of this as being related to increased agricultural productivity in the first instance, which is associated with new technologies. So new technology plus capital frees up labour and provides cheap food. Cheap labour plus cheap food makes cheap things. So let me go over that again. I may not have been so clear. Increased agricultural productivity associated with new technology enables, actually, the way it's perceived at the time is that people are no longer able to live on their land, therefore they go into the cities looking for jobs. But meanwhile, the farms are still producing cheap food, which means that there is cheap food and cheap labour to make cheap things. The economic development from the 1980s was focused largely on exports. The profit from those exports is directed into investment, roads, houses, universities, factories. And the wages from the workers who are employed in that construction work is recycled domestically as consumption. Hence more profit, more investment, more sales. The increasing, so that's looking at it from the agricultural side. Looking at it from the manufacturing side, additional capital, human resources and technology is being brought together to make stuff, and because people are getting wages, they are then in a position to buy stuff. The increasing productivity frees up labour to make and sell more expensive things, and while that labour is getting wages, then those wages are redirected into consumption. The profits and taxes redirected from investment into social security leads to more household expenditure, and the domestic economy is stoked by higher wages and increasing social security. At the present time, the decline in profits from trade are being balanced by a growing domestic economy. And as I've mentioned already, this has been stoked in some degree by a huge increase in expenditure on health insurance to encourage people to stop saving against the risk of healthcare because they are reassured about the availability of health security. So I'm talking about these two dynamics from 1980 to now. One is the parallel dynamic of the continuing dynamic of the long boom. This Fordist relationship of employment leads to wages, leads to consumption. Okay, in the rich world, however, we're dealing with a very different dynamic. It's called the threat of overproduction and overaccumulation. This is where expanding productive capacity, capital-intensive production, technology-intensive production, with stagnating employment growth exceeds effective demand because some markets are saturated or mature and the markets with real needs have limited purchasing capacity. Let's get that clear. As production is increasingly based on capital, on technology and so-called jobless growth, then employment as a conduit for converting wages into consumption gradually is choked off. There are a number of compensatory mechanisms which can exacerbate the damage of this overproduction. In the corporate world, overproduction, this jobless growth, is seen in terms of profitability. In the policy world, it's seen as falling growth rates. Both the corporate strategies and the policy responses in many respects exacerbate the risk of crisis. The other side of this overproduction is over-accumulation. Because there is a reduced flow of profit into productive investment because of sluggish demand, there is an increased flow of profit into mergers and acquisitions. These have the effect of reducing capacity, increasing market share, but also reducing employment. And asset speculation, increased flow of profit into the housing market, the share market, the currency market, the futures market, and debt-funded consumption. Debt-funded consumption is about where the financial sector increases the direction of funds into the household sector, which continues to consume, but increasingly is doing so on the basis of debt. The most obvious feature of this phase of overaccumulation is the expansion of the financial sector, with huge increases of employment in the financial sector, increase of profit, and increase in political influence. So let's look at the way in which the capitalist system as a whole responds to declining growth. So these are the compensatory system responses to declining growth. And I've listed 4 system responses. First of all, we've talked about the diversion of investment into the financial sector. So the profit from trade and production flows into financial institutions. Secondly, I've talked about the private consumption being increasingly supported by private debt. In the major way in which this happened in the US in the lead up to the 2008 crash was that the value of your house increases, your borrowing capacity increases, you buy more boats or whatever, buy bigger houses, effective, but all on the basis of mortgages and on the basis of a housing bubble, that the asset values are unsustainable. So nevertheless, under those circumstances, private consumption is supported through private debt. The third system response is corporate rationalisation, including closures and bankruptcies and mergers and acquisitions, all of which are then going to be financed through corporate debt. And of course, I've already talked about the increasing size and power of the financial sector. So what are the corporate strategies? So I've just talked therefore about the system responses. Now in this slide I'm talking about the corporate responses to reduced profitability. How do the companies respond to this slowing of profit? First of all, they turn east to participate in China's growth, which of course depends upon its markets in the US and in the EU. So if you can invest in China and sell stuff in the rich world, then you are able to participate in the continuing boom in China. Secondly, it's about creating new markets, new products, and better marketing. And one of the best ways of creating new markets is to commodify the social. What I mean here is the marketizing of what once might have been family functions, community functions, and public sector functions. So the privatization of public services, the enclosure of community functions, and the commodification of family functions are all part of creating new markets. The fourth dot point is about externalizing costs. That if you're facing a declining profit rate, then if you can externalize your costs to labour and externalize your costs to the environment, then you can maintain your profits. Increasing market power, in particular through intellectual property strategies, through monopoly strategies, through mergers and acquisitions, gives you a capacity to increase prices. Consolidating production and increasing market share, reducing wages, replacing well-paid labour with technology is a set of strategies which all further reduce demand because they reduce the role of employment in recycling wages into consumption. Okay, now let's review where we're going. I've introduced the idea of overproduction, a crisis of overproduction, and with over-accumulation. And I've talked then about, first of all, compensatory system responses, how the system responds to declining growth. And I've talked on this slide to some of those features, some of which make the situation worse. Then I talked about how the corporations respond to reduced profitability. And then in this third slide, I've talked about compensatory policy responses. As governments perceive a slowing of growth, what are the compensatory policy responses? Some of which are the same as the corporate responses. Firstly, turn east to participate in China's growth. Secondly, outsource and privatise public sector provision, creating new market opportunities and therefore growth opportunities. Third, deregulate environmental controls because the corporations say this is unnecessary red tape, but it has the effect of converting natural capital into recurrent revenue. So in other words, the corporations are increasingly able to externalize their costs to the environment, and that will then show up as GDP. Force repayment of debt from the third world countries. Force the third world countries to open their markets and their economies to the products and services of the transnationals who are based in the rich world, under the slogan of free trade. Cut taxes, in particular reduce corporate and executive taxes in order to compete for new investment. And finally, deregulate the labour market in order to reduce labour costs. Now, the dot points that I've asterisked will have the effect of further reducing demand. If you force repayment of debt from third world countries, they will not be buying your stuff. If you force the third world countries to open their markets, they will not have their own wages in order to buy stuff. If you cut taxes, then public spending will reduce the employment and so forth. So, therefore, I've talked about the system responses, the corporate responses, and the policy responses to the slowdown associated with the post-Fordist crisis. The adverse consequences of these policy responses is that we replace high-wage labour with low wages and with technology, but that has the effect of exacerbating this overhang of productive capacity over effective demand. You're reducing demand and the excess productive capacity is increased. It has the effect of increasing economic integration globally, creates new barriers to the developing countries to participate in the global economy. Increasing economic integration globally expands the market for the established transnational producers, but further exacerbates the overhang with respect to effective demand. Sure, they can get access to the middle class of India and the middle class of China, but at the cost of increasing the exclusion of the marginalised and excluded people of Africa, Latin America and Asia. And finally, deregulation and externalising costs to the environment further destabilises the global environment, in particular global warming. So what prevents the crisis I've been describing from engulfing the economy globally? Well, I think the situation is already critical for 1 billion poor people in rich and poor countries around the world. We have a trading regime which forces the flow of value from the poor to the rich countries. We have a policy regime which enforces the divide between those who participate in the new global economy and those who are excluded. And for the latter group, let's say 1 billion, the crisis has already arrived. They are living with this crisis. However, the continued global growth, albeit slower, has been supported through growth in China and India and other emerging economies, through the commodification of family, community, government functions, through the unsustainable exploitation of environmental services, through the role of debt in sustaining demand, through global support for US consumption, because the world is supporting an overvalued dollar, and through intensive transfer of value from the periphery to the centre, from the south to the north. A major feature of this regime is that capital is being recycled as consumption through debt. We now tend to think about profit and savings as being equivalent to investment, that profit and savings will go into investment in the creation of new productive capacity. What's been happening increasingly, though, has been that profit and savings have been redirected as loans. Lending to support corporate rationalisation, financed through corporate debt, lending to support household consumption through increasing household debt, and lending to support government fiscal shortfalls through fiscal debt. All of which contribute to the increasing size and wealth and turnover and power of the financial sector. So with slowing growth, business redirects profit into the financial sector, into portfolio investment and speculation in money markets, currency markets, futures markets, rather than new direct investment. New financial derivatives encourage risky lending and speculation and new bubbles. The bidding up of asset values on borrowed or non-existent money feeds consumption expenditure through this so-called wealth effect. If you think you've got more money, you spend more money. But actually, when the bubble bursts, you find you're in debt. The privatisation of pensions has redirected billions of money from tax into savings, held by private financial institutions and then lent on for asset speculation and consumption. And finally, state support of the financial sector, that's to say when the banks get into trouble, they're too big to fail, encourages the banks to continue irresponsible lending and excessive debt creation. An important part of this story is global support for US consumption. I've touched upon this, but on this slide I elaborate in a bit more detail. The US has had since over the last 15 years a trade deficit. This simply means that imports exceed exports. They're buying more from the outside world than they are selling. This means that US traders need to buy more foreign currency than they earn, and this should lead to a fall in the value of the US dollar, that more people want other currencies, fewer people want US dollars. This should make US exports cheaper and imports more expensive. But over this period, China, Germany, the OPEC countries and other corporations and countries have lent money to the US by buying US government bonds. It's the most secure way of storing their value. It has the effect of keeping the US dollar high, which keeps US consumption spending and inflation low and keeps the global economy ticking over. So the Chinese, let's say, lend money to the US by buying US bonds. They keep their profit they make exports, they make profit on exports. Instead of sending the profit home and selling the US dollars and buying RMB, they buy US bonds, keep their money in dollars, but it keeps the US dollar high. So the US dollar keeps on buying Chinese goods. It's a It's a house of cards until the subprime mortgage crisis. Okay, so what happened with the subprime mortgage crisis? The asset bubble burst. What had been seen as wealth associated with rising and rising house prices becomes debt because the houses are not worth so much, and people find that their mortgage is more than the value of their house. The use of doubtful collateral to support borrowing is revealed. In other words, a whole lot of people have borrowed against assets which were not worth very much, and this is part of the financial crookery. There is a credit squeeze. The banks stop lending money because they know that they've got huge debts. They start saving their own money to cover their own debts. Because they stop lending money, credit dries up, consumption contracts, and because credit and consumption slow down, production slows down, employment slows down, and we get a global recession. In particular because of the significance of the US market to global exporters. There's a risk of the US dollar falling. This was what happened with the subprime mortgage crisis. This was exported into Europe because Europe, in particular Germany, was a strong exporter. It was storing its surplus in US government bonds. The euro was strong, in other words, was able to buy, lots of people with euros were able to buy relatively more stuff, and the financial system was flush with cash. The financial system based in Germany was lending money to the peripheral European countries, both lending money to households, to corporations, and to governments. When the credit freeze hit, the German banks demanded their money back. Regardless of any irresponsibility of their lending, they were supported in this by the so-called Troika, the European Central Bank, the IMF, and the EU Commission. The banks were too big to fail, the countries were put into trouble, and they were forced to pay their debts through austerity. The issue which is being raised here is whether irresponsible borrowing is more wrong than irresponsible lending. And many people would say that what was happening here was irresponsible lending. Okay, now I slipped over a slide earlier, which I want to go back to, because these are the circumstances in which there is a continuing necessary transfer of value from the south to the north. We've talked about debt repayment and the role of the IMF and structural adjustment in mediating debt repayment. But one of the dynamics of this flow of value from the south to the north has been the need to maintain high dollar reserves at low interest rates as insurance against a currency crisis. In other words, a country like Indonesia, which was badly hit by the 1997 Asian financial crisis, now sells stuff and uses a lot of its reserves, a lot of the revenue from selling stuff overseas to buy US bonds, to put their money in US bonds, having the effect of maintaining the high US dollar, maintaining the buying power of the US dollar, not because they're particularly concerned about the buying power of the US dollar, but as insurance against speculation, against currency crisis, and they need to have these reserves so they can defend their currency against a currency crisis such as occurred in 1997. Now this means that they're getting low interest rates from the dollar, from the US bonds. It means that if they need to borrow money for real investment, they will be paying much higher interest rates for it. So the excess in interest rates that is paid for real investment in the developing countries over the value of the interest rates they're getting from US bonds is a further conduit of a flow of value from the south to the north. Brain drain is a huge flow of value, tax evasion, outright theft, unfair trade, and declining terms of trade are all ways in which resources flow from the south to the north. And the value of development assistance is dwarfed by these channels. Now, I'm conscious that there's a huge amount in this slide, in this presentation, which, if you're not familiar with this stuff, might be tricky to grasp first time round. I urge you to pick it up again later, to have a second and third run through the slides and investigate some of the issues which are unfamiliar. Okay, so then we talked about the subprime mortgage crisis, the European sovereign debt crisis. Now let's look at some of these doubtful recovery strategies. The first is to save the banks. We transfer the debt to the taxpayer to be paid off through austerity. This doesn't have anything to do with the underlying dynamics of the crisis. But meanwhile, and there has been talk about improved regulation of the banks. Meanwhile, however, the rich countries, led by Australia apparently, are trying to negotiate a new trade agreement called the Trade in Services Agreement, which includes provisions to protect the banks from tighter regulation. It's a complex issue. We refloat the economy, the second recovery strategy. We refloat the economy through massive government expenditure and through printed money, in particular through so-called quantitative easing, which is about printing money and flowing it into the economy at low interest rates. Well, what's happening now is that the quantitative easing is being lifted, which will mean that there will be a massive flow of resources into the US financial sector as interest rates increase, because there's less money available, which means that there will be an outflow of money from the emerging economies, which have been told they should not impose capital controls because the IMF for a long time punished capital controls, which means that the burden of coping with this financial crisis is therefore transferred to the emerging economies and the developing countries, and so it continues. The third dot point is austerity. We reduce wages and public expenditure in order to pay off the debt. But reduced wages and reduced public expenditure means reduced consumption, means reduced profits, means that both businesses and countries maintain in sluggish growth. We might boost consumer spending, maybe through increased debt. We defer action on climate change. We reduce spending on development assistance, and we demonize the refugees. These are highly dubious recovery strategies, in my view. So I talked earlier about neoliberalism, and I think you can see that the policy paradigm of neoliberalism is really very well suited to managing the crisis of overproduction in the interests of the corporations. I won't go over this slide again, but I do want to focus on one question, which is neoliberalism. Is this an objective, universal and necessary policy paradigm? Margaret Thatcher was famous for her use of the term, there is no alternative, or TINA, there is no alternative to her policies. Or alternatively, is it a partisan policy package managing the threat of post-Fordist crisis in accordance with the perspectives and interests of transnational corporations, transnational capitalist class, and the political hirelings of the above. Okay, which brings us back to public health. What are the implications for health policy of the neoliberal economic policy agenda? Well, they're fairly familiar. Privatised and stratified healthcare, widening global inequality, the continued exclusion of what Frantz Fanon referred to as the wretched of the earth from economic participation, farmers driven off their land by dumped agricultural imports, child deaths, maternal deaths, lack of clean water, open defecation, unemployment, the burdens of the wretched of the earth. The food crisis, partly associated with some people eating far too much meat, the use of agricultural resources to grow petrol, and speculation in food. Violence, conflict, and mass migrations. These are the consequences of this widening inequality. The continued financial instability and crisis, and of course, the dubious role of development assistance, making not very much impact on the fundamentals of this problem, but appearing to legitimate the continued existence of this regime. Are there alternative directions? Well, yes, there are. I'm not suggesting this is the truth, but I urge you to explore the usefulness of this crisis of overproduction analysis. I urge consideration of restoring the sovereignty of the nation state, reducing the power of the transnational banks and the transnational corporations to dictate policy to the nation state, moving towards greater equality or democracy in global governance, away from big power hegemony, protecting local production, local supply, and local services. This is the Chinese path. Forging new alliances between progressive forces in the north and in the global south. Promoting domestic security, economic and cultural security as a condition for generosity, e.g., for example, to refugees. And valuing communication and personal contact as conditions for solidarity. I think these are some interesting new directions which can be usefully looked at. On this slide, I've listed some of the resources, some further reading, some of the resources I've relied upon in building this story that I've shared with you. Where shall we start in terms of a discussion? Can I ask you to explain the two-way relations between macroeconomics and both healthcare and population health? Why don't you draw up a 2x2 table and see what goes in the cells of that table? What was the long boom? Can you explain the high global growth rates during the period 45 to 75? Can you explain the debt trap? How was the debt trap set? How was it sprung? And what was the price of escaping? Can you explain the theory of a crisis of overproduction? And why is a crisis of overproduction also a crisis of overaccumulation? Can you explain the dynamics which led to the US subprime mortgage crisis? What caused the European sovereign debt crisis? And so forth and so on. I really look forward to sharing these questions with you and learning from our discussion of them. Thanks very much.